That was the defunct but still periodically deadly Canadian band Red Rider with Lunatic Fringe from the Season 2 soundtrack of Mindhunter on Netflix. Mindhunter, of course, the quasi-historically based tale of the original FBI criminal profiling unit, the first serial killer hunters. Serial killers always make me think of Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, deep in a psychiatric prison cell, saying to Clarice Starling that any sane society would have killed him or put him to some use long ago. That's an interesting idea. What would it mean to put such a monster to some use? Well, in a sense, there's always an unfortunate need for multiple murderers in society. That's what soldiers do in overt wars and 007s do in covert wars. But soldiers and secret agents seem to have a different social status than serial killers. They give us a very different feeling. Being a multiple murderer is among the lowest and vilest thing a human being can do. It has a very negative status. Although, of course, there are people who write to these killers in prison or even marry them, people perhaps for whom human predatory skill, notoriety, and a command of dark powers is something oddly positive in their minds. These sickos might disagree with us about the status of depraved killers, just like a general in a war might disagree with us about the significance of slaughtering people repeatedly. It's not always easy to judge the status of anything in a universe in which the very measurements of physics seem to be intrinsically relative and context-dependent. I imagine a newly hired vice principal at an elementary school would be threatened by accusations of being a devil worshiper, womanizer, or uncontrollable drug-addled wild man, but these same accusations that threaten to destabilize his fragile professional status might well raise the status of a rock musician and add an extra dash of glamour to his anarchic superhuman image. It's not totally clear what the value of values should be, and if you've just dropped in to see what condition the status of your status is in, then you'll be thrilled to know I'm Layman Pascal III, and you're listening to the Status of Status edition on the Cinematic Asylum on CILU 102.7 FM, coming to you live from so-called Northern Ontario, even though we're only about a quarter of the way up the province. You know, lots of comedians have made this joke that humans picking up canine excrement, taking dogs for walks, feeding them, grooming them, etc. would suggest to an alien visitor that these dogs were the master race and we were the lowly servants. On the other hand, we have the impression that it's our wisdom, empathy, superior power that inclines us to approve of these animals, to breed them, to care for them rather than abuse them, to bring them into our homes, an increase in our dignity perhaps by taking upon ourselves the responsibility of caring for these creatures. What happens when you bend over to pick up a still warm lump of another creature's excrescence? Are you being lowered in value? Or, on the contrary, are you rising in worth by this gesture of grotesque self-overcoming? We worry and even fight each other about status a lot of the time, but are we even sure we know what it is? Looks to me like status must be something that looks different depending on how and from where you look at it. Put that in your sense of self-worth and smoke it. How do you know if something is raising or lowering your status? Assuming, of course, that status is a real thing. Traditionally, it's said that the sta of status is basically the same as the sta of state and the sta of stand. You stand for something, you have a standing. If you stand for something with enough status, they'll put up a statue of you standing somewhere, you see? You have a status and a status update. You gain status by standing up to someone or maybe standing tall and appearing to have status. You have standing in your society and a status card and a fancy status symbol that wards off status anxiety. Maybe your status is where you stand in the pecking order, unless pecking orders were just made up by people who projected their own status anxiety onto the habits of natural creatures who might be better than people or worse than people depending on where you stand. You might lose status if you take the wrong stand on an issue, and to be honest, how do things stand with the state of affairs? Good question. I'll need more data on the status of unfolding events in order to answer that question, and in part my answer will depend on my own mental status, which is to say my state of mind, upon which I shall have no choice but to make my stand. Or will I? Sta. That's kind of the question today. Do you have a choice about your status? Do you have valid options for interpreting things that might have positive or negative implications for your status depending on how you take them? Who do you think gets to decide your status? How would you even recognize the status quo if you saw it out quoing in a field somewhere? Canada's second most prolific instrumental soundtrack artist, Christophe Beck, with a sampler platter of short pieces from the movie The Hangover. I'm Layman Pascal, and you're listening to The Status of Status on the Cinematic Asylum on CILU 102.7 FM. If someone revs their car engine really loud and peels out, and the people standing around shake their heads, grumble, or ironically say it's impressive, what signal does that send to the driver? Is his status raised or lowered? Is he a filthy malcontent because of the content of your commentary about him? Or, on the contrary, is he raised above you merely because you are now reacting to him? Who's in the power position? It seems like saying crazy offensive things would lower you and disqualify you from, say, being president, but maybe it's the very reason some people will vote for you, and maybe lots of old politicians who once upon a time stepped down after a scandal came out didn't really need to step down at all. Maybe they bought into a story that the status-shifting effect of a scandal was negative and obvious to everyone, but who knows? Maybe they were wrong about the status of status, and perhaps they should have just doubled down and told everyone how much they like Chilean prostitutes, methamphetamines, and how they don't see it as contradictory to their position as head of the Conservative Morals League. After all, who's to say what the value of an evaluation really is? A lot of our coaches and quasi-spiritual self-help assistants and downloadable self-esteem apps tell us that we have the ability, even the right, and possibly the need to reframe issues. How many of us mouth off about some negative event before calming down and saying, well, maybe it's for the best? Maybe it's for the best? What the hell does that mean? It means that maybe the negative value was actually a positive value all along? What? If we can be wrong about positive and negative values by quickly shifting them, then we've got to start leading a life of intense suspiciousness, don't we? I mean, what does it say about you if you can just change your mind about the status of someone's status, the status of your own status, the status of anything? Can you change all those values, or is it only some things you can change your mind about? Maybe you remember, or maybe you've heard about the satanic cult scare in the early 1980s. Supposedly kids with 20-sided dice and a copy of Nightmare on Elm Street on Betamax video cassette were being seduced into occultism and then ritually abused by devil-worshipping cabals in basements, sewers, and secluded forest glades. The Satanic Panic. Right-wing Christian moralists were out on the streets and on the radios and on the television telling people with a straight face and an almost hysterical twang in their voice that forces of evil, real evil, the lowest and worst thing of all, the force of anti-value itself, these godless and God-hating monsters were out there raping and harming our poor innocent children. Well, of course, it turned out this wasn't happening at all. Dungeons & Dragons were harmless gaming fun, and there were no attacks by satanic cults, but that's not the whole story. It turned out in hindsight that there were cabals of people performing and covering up regular ritual abuse and the molestation of children. These abusers were generally part of Christian churches who turned out to be involved in one of the largest organized child abuse scenarios ever dreamed of. Not all Christians, of course, not by a long shot. But the interesting thing here is that people who appeared to have the moral high ground, who claimed the most positive status, the servants of the epitome of goodness, were actually doing the worst thing. While the people who they denounced as terrible, as low-status beings, were doing fine, normal, healthy things. So who's high and who's low in that scenario? Is the Catholic Church under some conditions worse than Satanism? That sounds a bit extreme to me, but honestly I don't care, at least not today. Today I only care about why any of us ever get the impression that somebody has some up status and somebody else doesn't, and that something decided that from a certain angle. Serial killer John Wayne Gacy has a children's clown job and is a member of the Chamber of Commerce. People always say that like it's puzzling. How could someone in such a vaunted position, a member of the local Chamber of Commerce, for God's sake, be involved in anything immoral? How could my neighbor be a paranoid racist? After all, he smiles and waves at me when I walk down to get my mail in the morning. How could Alice be a drug addict? She's from such a good family. She went to Harvard. We make or hear all these implied status claims that seem to run afoul of status facts, and that could go in any direction, positive or negative. A lady airplane pilot, what the heck? A socialist running for president, a sensible word from Cousin Steve for a change, a good Samaritan, who would have believed it? People even deliberately create all these gossipy little contradictory clickbait tidbits in which two differently valenced social facts are placed in juxtaposition in order to make your brain behave so badly that you'll buy a newspaper or keep watching CNN. These are all examples of a micro shift in status. The Queen humiliated, a cat driving a car, a homeless man winning the lottery. The old status switcheroo, but from what status to which status? We often don't even inquire. These things all seem to have the same archetypal structure as a joke. The wily old coyote builds a rocket whose incredible blast of acceleration will easily overtake that darned roadrunner, and when he flips that ignition switch, bam, right into a rock wall. Or you run heroically fast only to notice you've run beyond the cliff and are now hanging in midair pre-plummet. The status of your status has just shifted. A build-up, denouement. Jokes make us aware, or at least they could make us aware, that we were ascribing a status to something without realizing it. We don't realize it until the status is yanked out by the next part of the joke. A well-dressed banker slipping on a banana peel might seem funny to some, but only really if you subconsciously first thought that a well-dressed banker is somehow special and put up into a high place from which he could fall. The very existence of comedy sort of indicates that we all detect very regularly that the status of status is something fluid, changing, shifting, surprising itself. Yet most of the time we default into thinking that it's more or less fixed, that it maybe needs to be rebelled against, or that we're trapped in an obvious and constant status situation that was invented by someone else. Now, there are real problems with status, of course, but we do have to be aware also that it's tricksy, slippery, reversey, not as straightforward as it seems. For example, many folks today think transgendered people should have their own bathrooms, but black people shouldn't. Black folks used to have their own bathrooms and water fountains in public places like sports arenas and movie theaters. And there's an interesting question here that people don't usually ask themselves because they're usually, and probably quite rightly, more concerned about the immediate well-being of groups they identify with. But is it better to have your own bathrooms or not? Is it in general a greater sign of respect to give you your own bathroom, or a greater sign of respect to include you in regular bathrooms? Forget practicality for a second, forget ethics, forget the ergonomics of urinals, and just think about the notion of implied cultural honor and whether normal is a step up or a step down from your previous implied cultural honor or your intrinsic sense of personal worth. Do we in fact honor women by having female washrooms, or do we dishonor them by keeping them apart? Were black folks honored or dishonored by having their bathrooms in those 1920s baseball stadiums? Seems pretty well known publicly that they were dishonored by it, but who makes that decision? Was there disagreement about it within various communities? Seems like this could be a dangerous topic. Seems like a lot of people have a hair trigger either about their own status or about their perception of the status of large public groups. People will freak out at you if you speak the wrong way about status, and that's not new. I know we talk about political correctness and social justice warriors as if they were some new phenomenon, a postmodern phenomenon rooted in neo-feminism, neo-Marxism, or the invasion of the academy by French deconstructors. But really, it goes way back with all kinds of different intellectual garb over the generations. Arguably, most of it's a pre-modern concern. After all, what do you think was going on in those feudal courts? Constant jockeying for status, constant concern about who gets to be called what, which terms are honoring which people or groups appropriately, what's offensive at the moment. Back then, people would flip out, kill themselves, go to war, fight a duel if you insulted their honor or their perception of the honor of a group by using the wrong phrase. The feudal court was a social networking site. And it's still the case if you say the N-word, the F-word, the C-word, the Q-word, or that other even more offensive term that starts with an apostrophe and has 3 H's in it. People might explode at you. I feel dirty even thinking those terms. But the question is, how did they decide that they knew for sure, knew absolutely what status was implied by the word they just heard someone use? What about you? Is it even possible for you to imagine that some random black guy at a ball game in the 1940s felt honored by having his own bathroom, as if it was appropriate for him, whatever he perceived his type to be, appropriate for him to be distinguished? Why not? Why does that feel weird? When the peasants are walking and the queen is the only one getting carried, it's obvious she doesn't fit in. She's discriminated. She's excluded from the norm. She's distinguished, set apart, but like a holy place. Now, forget the objective fact that some people have much nicer situations than others, and not always for good reasons. We are well aware of the problems created historically by primitive institutional and social patterns, which combine, along with some of their glorious and inherited brilliance, many useless and descriptively vile inequalities. Put that aside for a moment and just focus in on this issue of being singled out, of standing out, of being distinguished, of the sta in standing being the sta from status. Do you see how being distinguished could be positive or negative? And you see how it's not totally clear who gets to make that decision or interpretation. Is it you? Do you get to decide if being singled out is positive or negative? Maybe, but you only get to decide if you're aware of the options, aware that a choice is possible. So I'm walking down a road, right? And dogs are barking at me from people's properties. It's irritating, even a little threatening, and worse, stupid. The dogs sound insensible, lacking in nuance, repetitive. There's a thing, there's a thing, there's a thing, like a car alarm coming at me over and over, not evaluating, not getting used to me, not figuring out what I am or really seeing anything, just reacting loudly and repetitively to a generalized phenomenon. Ugly, speciesist. Not even helpful, really, in guarding the property from encroachment. Just like a bored, unintelligent person yelling at you because they happen to see you in public. So I'm put off by all this as I walk by. But then I decide that maybe I'm being elevated by the phenomenon. After all, didn't people play stupid trumpets when the emperor strode past them in public? What if this dog barking is really fanfare? What if they're rejoicing? What if they're shouting to the world about the mere presence of glorious old me? Well, now my mood has shifted, and I've learned a little bit of a lesson about the leverage I might have over my interpretations of whether I'm being lowered or raised when I'm singled out by stupid things.
CILU is supported in part by the students of Lakehead University, our sponsors, and our listeners. At this time, we would like to thank the following sponsors for their continuous support.
Copperfin Credit Union, Northwestern Ontario's largest locally owned credit union. Experience the convenience of their mobile banking app and online financial solutions anywhere, anytime. Copperfin Credit Union, life forward. Sarah Curtin, your neighborhood realtor. She's on top of what's happening at Thunder Bay's Market, and she'll help you buy or sell your home. Call or text her anytime at 632-3635 or find her online at sarahcurtin.com. The Walleye, the definitive source for information on music, food, art, and entertainment in Thunder Bay. This month's issue is on stands for free now. Find it around town or online and interactive at thewalleye.ca.
Apparat, with the theme from the astonishingly well-dubbed German time travel Netflix series Dark. I'm some kind of layman Pascal, and this is the Status of Status edition of the Cinematic Asylum on CILU 102.7 FM, not to be confused with MF 7.201 ULIC, our sister station in the reversed Bizarro universe. Now, consider the lobster in the parking lot. Consider the parking lobster. Or forget the lobster and just consider the parking lot. There are lots of vague rectangles there, painted on concrete or asphalt to indicate where automobiles can be temporarily stored without drivers. Some of these spots are sanctified. They're marked with special glyphs and symbols. They are not for general public use, but they are reserved. Who or what type of person in our society is being honored with this special status? Well, it's the cripple, so to speak. These are what the locals call handicapped parking spots. This is official special needs parking. But how strange this might seem to a time traveler or an alien who has often visited this earth over the centuries. He would expect to see, as is usual on the earth, that special spots are reserved for wealthy, famous, and powerful people. The lords and ladies usually have reserved spaces, markings that set them apart and set them above. What does it mean now that we have official special needs parking? Have we set the cripple, the legless, the palsied, the injured, the blind above and apart from the rest of us? How strange that might seem in an historical sense. One could even be shocked and horrified. Is this not a sign of decadence, of corruption? What sort of society is this now? What kind of future could there be for people who honor, instead of their greatest successes and capacities, they're physically and mentally disadvantaged, they're injured? Not only do they give special sparking, we should not even call them disadvantaged. We call them alternatively advantaged. We should not insult them, for are they not our superiors? A strange bit of logic, you see. It's not how we normally think of all this, but of course the situation is a bit ambiguous. One argument is that this stuff doesn't matter at all. Another is that we've become a civilization of greater empathy, and this reflects our new values. Another is that we have devalued our actual aristocrats and healthy, smart, capable people and begun promoting our least able. That could be a bad sign. Like someone who always wants to tell you what's wrong at a party, that's a bad sign. Or it could be a sign, actually, that today's real nobles are now so far above the average person that they've withdrawn into a cloud of obscurity and abandoned parking lots as unnecessary trivia far below their dignity. Maybe they do not even deign to be concerned about such things anymore. My kingdom is not of this world, said the Lord, and therefore, said the Lord, the meek can go ahead and inherit this earth. I have no need of it now. The elect have gone to a much better place. Wow, I'm doing a lot of gymnastic play with Western religious stuff today. I hope you have it in your heart to forgive me one way or another. I guess I'm sort of a Christian, at least if Kierkegaard and the Borgias were Christians. That's a pretty inclusive group. I did grow up in a Christian household, well, a post-Christian, neo-Taoist, neo-pagan, pluralistic, pragmatic, agnostic, ecological household, but I'd argue that post-Christian is still a kind of Christian. We had a Bible lying around, and we said, God damn it, or Jesus H. Christ when we hit our thumbs accidentally with hammers. I might even have let fly a couple of jumpin' Jehoshaphat's just for fun. And frankly, all the horror movies I ever watched always needed a rogue, black-cloaked Jesuit priest to exorcise those demons. We celebrated Christmas. We were part of Christendom in the most general sense. I even had a few dreams about that old ragged-bearded Jew who, I was told, and this is interesting because this is the Christian ideology as far as I was concerned, was some kind of embodied avatar of a universal deity. This was the story of Christianity, normative in my household, I guess, among family and friends, in the books I read, on the radio I listened to, and the TV shows I watched. Not the story that you can only be redeemed by blind faith acceptance in a particular version of a particular savior. It was a story that among a handful of enlightened avatars from human history, there was also this Christian one who put a special emphasis on love, poor people, and forgiveness, and whose very first spiritual followers stood up to the oppressive Roman government and shocked everyone with how their faith kept them calm in the face of crucifixion and being fed to lions. This so shook the spirit of Rome you couldn't even believe it. It emboldened the slaves who rose up in a socialist insurrection, aided by Constantine's dreams, and created Christianity, which promptly absorbed Aristotle and then went back immediately to betraying and perverting all of Jesus' teachings in a now orthodox, state-friendly institution that just rode around and basically committed atrocities and kept people ignorant. Now, I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying that when I was a boy, that seemed to be the basic general implied story about Christianity that I thought everyone believed. It's the one I heard about the most. When I got a little older, I went through a number of different interpretations internally. I thought maybe there was no historical Jesus, but maybe there was a cosmic Christ. Maybe I was Jesus. Maybe Jesus was a political zealot. I read that in a book. And maybe Paul saved Christianity by making it into an actual spiritual system out of some political phenomenon, or maybe it was the exact reverse of that. Maybe Jesus was an alien abductee. Maybe he was a magic mushroom personified by the drug-gobbling Gnostics who penned the Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe John the Baptist was the real savior, or Simon Magus. And if there wasn't an historical genius, And if, like it says in the Zeitgeist documentaries, all the plot points are based on ancient archetypal and astrological patterns found in many other Near Eastern religions, even then someone had to have said all those neat sayings, right? Or did they? Maybe the sayings are thousands of years old and the Essenian monks just passed them on and invented a character to be their mouthpiece. Who knows? Maybe only ambiguity is available on the marketplace these days. My point, I guess you can tell, is that there are a lot of interpretations if you open to them. There's no reason you should, of course. Maybe just stick with your long-practiced feeling on the subject. Great. But if you do make yourself available to alternative interpretations, you will quickly find that each new one requires you to do some kind of value reversal. That is to say, your impression of who wins and who loses, of what's important and not important, of what lifts up a worth and what lowers down a worth, will all have to be melted, kicked up in the air, sent out to lunch, or spin like a pie plate on a vaudevillian stick. One of the ideas that did that to me most dramatically, caused me to wonder about my basic values in regards to the stories, is what they call Vespasianism. Actually, nobody calls it that except me, but I need to call it something. It's this idea that several very prominent contemporary historians have put forth, that there was no conflict between Christianity and Imperial Rome. That runs right up against the story I thought I was learning as a child. Their idea is that under Vespasian and his son Titus, the first of the Flavian emperors, there arose an imperially sponsored new sect of Judaism that couldn't have been more pro-Roman. In an age when Jewish terrorists and or freedom fighters were a constant problem for the Roman government, imagine the Roman wish list. Imagine what kind of Jews the Roman government would really like. Jews who ignored Jewish traditions, didn't get circumcised, desired a kingdom that wasn't of this world, rendered unto Caesar what was Caesar's, adopted the Roman custom of believing in a divine human man-god, obeyed all the local laws, got mad at old Jewish religious and political authorities, joined up with Greeks and Romans, advocated not fighting their enemies, forgave transgressions, and worshipped self-sacrifice? It's hard not to see that this is precisely the ideal form of Jew as far as the Romans of that time period were concerned. Sure, there's a variety of archaeological and scriptural evidence for the theory, but that's not important today. It's not important whether it's true or not. It's important that it's an example of the kind of thing that might revalue your values, or give your sense of the status of your statuses a whole new status. To explore a new story or a new interpretation, you have to be willing to let down your sense of status of things, or let them up. Let them go up or down a little or a lot. Suppose you were seated up on a golden throne, perhaps even atop a golden pyramid. You're very high up, as befits your very great status. All the peasants bow down before you. But this is a very local vision, a very flat earth vision. As far as the emperor on the far side of the round world is concerned, you are now even further below him, farther away below than are your peasants. You see how readily and oddly the status of status can be dramatically reversed.
If I could, I would turn back into dust. You would look so good to me, I could almost taste it. One moment I'm a king, the next minute nothing. I just wanted to feel alright, but it's not that simple. I get low, 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 low on my own. I get low, 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 low on my own. in the palm of my hand, an empire summoned, and as it was born, all substance crumbled. It was a vain attempt at the meaning of life, and I should have better ways of spending my time, like climb the mountain, like sail the sea, like build my house up or start my family. It's time to get out. It's time to make a living. I'll reach the summit, but I come tumbling back down. I get low, 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 low on my own. I get low, 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 low on my own. I get low, 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 low on my own. I get low, 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 low on my own.
I bombed Korea every night. My engine sank into the salty sky. I didn't know if I would live or die. I bombed Korea every night. I bombed Korea every night. I bombed Korea every night. Red flowers bursting down below us. Those people didn't even know us. We didn't know if we would live or die. We didn't know if it was wrong or right. I bombed Korea every night. And so I sit here at this bar. I'm not a hero, I'm not a movie star. I've got my beer, I've got my stories to tell, but they won't tell you what it's like in hell. Red flowers bursting down below us. Those people didn't even know us. We didn't know if we would live or die. We didn't know if it was wrong or right. We didn't know if we would live or die. I bomb Korea every night.
Timber Timber getting low and cake bombing Korea every night. Hey, remember Tom Sawyer? Ha, what a scamp. Remember when Tom Sawyer tricked those other kids into painting that fence he'd been told to paint? It was a punishment, but he reinterpreted it as a sweet deal, and then they began to vie for it. The status of the fence work went from below them to above them in the twinkling of an eye. And who knows, maybe after Tom left there were 1,000 years of peace in a society with a fence-painting-based economy. We honor that story now. We honor him because of his tricky reversal of the worth of things. He gets status specifically from making worth seem worthless and the negative seem positive, and doing it so well that it basically becomes the new status of things. Tricky, tricky. Have you ever been ill or injured and had people gather around, bringing you stuff, doting on you, listening to your conversation? Were you reduced by the accident or raised to the level of an emperor all of a sudden? Shoppers at Walmart objectively have access to more kinds of goods and treats than even the greatest rulers of the ancient world. Why don't they then experience themselves as being vastly higher and more worthy than the greatest kings of the ancient world? That's certainly one of their interpretive options, but they seldom seem to take advantage of that opportunity. I don't see them standing tall, walking with the confident swagger of the blessed, relaxing into the abundance that reaches toward them from all sides, bathing in the light of the superlative honor and victory chemicals that are promised from every sign. But they could. We all could. Or could we? I was a weird kid, but then again, everyone's a weird kid. I had a number of advantages as a weird kid. Stable, loving home life, good food, decent brain, lots of nature to explore, no bombs going off, lots of books around. I was white and male in an epoch when there was a pretty good vibe around that kind of thing. Anyway, my main point is that these advantages translated into my feeling that my particular weirdness was perfectly normal. In fact, kids who were a lot more conventional than myself struck me as freaks. In my view, I was the relaxed and inevitable center of the universe, the higher standard model, the universal human. Whatever I was into was normal, and anybody who was into anything else, no matter how many of them there were a minority of weirdos with decadent taste. I was so normal, in fact, that I had normalcy to spare, and was even unusually non-judgmental and helpful to all the other kinds of freaks. I became good friends with people who seemed to think they were ostracized and rejected by some kind of mainstream. What they called the mainstream, I viewed, or rather felt, was just another bunch of misguided rejects. Didn't make any difference that there were more of them. Hell, there's plenty of ants. I didn't treat any group as excluded because I saw them as no different than the everyone else whom I treated as if they were excluded. And they were. They were all equally excluded by me. I was tolerant and magnanimous, though, even toward people who were obviously suffering from a learning disability in which they thought they were normal, popular kids with decent values and standard thinking, and even perhaps what folks call good prospects. I suspected they had all developed that patently false idea about themselves from watching American television, which was a popular pastime at that time in the past. Now, what did all of that look like from those other points of view? People who had the idea that they were low status or at least off to the side might have been happy that I treated them as no different. People who had the fantasy that they were high status might have been perplexed that I treated them as no different. The status of my views of their status and my views of my own status were up for grabs. There is plurality of perspectives on the subjects of who is being valued and when and by whom and for why, amen. You know, one time I saw a sign at Starbucks that said, "Who says mocha can't have a summer sidekick?" I sat there and I pondered that thing for a long time. Who says that mocha cannot have a summer sidekick? Well, nobody. Nobody says that. This sign presents an opportunity for rebellion against those pernicious and misguided busybodies who are apparently always telling you that mocha can't have a summer sidekick, some kind of iced mocha sugar milk drink. The idea is actually pretty weird. This huge corporation wants you to join up with many others in conforming to something that values them. They've set this up to extract monies from you, and they want you to obey because you are supposed to want to rebel against an oppressor who quite obviously does not exist. Are you sick of being told you can't buy a 10-pound wheel of cheese at Cheese World? Well, now you can. That'll show them. Are you tired of everyone judging you for voting Republican? Well, do it anyway. That'll show them. Fed up with jerks who say it's impossible to snort crack cocaine? Well, join me in this back alley and we'll show those oppressors who's boss. Sick of the war on Christmas? Tired of being told you can't say that, or at least of getting the impression online that some people somewhere are saying that you can't say that? Well, now you can rebel against those people. After all, conformity is under attack. The mainstream is now a minority. The status quo is almost gone. There's barely 2% of everyone left. Almost everybody's been kicked out of the group that consists of nearly everyone. My God, are you going to stand for that? It's intolerable. You shouldn't have to apologize for coming on down to the Apple Store and paying too much for a device that does fewer things but is shinier. Who says you can't pay twice as much to me for no reason? We'll show those jerks. This is about liberty. So if you see what I'm saying there, it's that the function of normal hegemonic society, whether it's corporate, traditional, or just casual, frequently enforces its norms as if it were organizing a rebellion. Isn't that interesting when it comes to considering status? Could it be because all nations were originally built up on tribes that were conquered by one particular tribe and enslaved into a self-sacrificial symbolic patriotic kingdom that consists of various tribalists trying to suppress other tribalists who were forced to sacrifice their ancestral status in order to serve the new symbols of the mass membership group? One rebellious subculture trying to keep down all the other rebellious subcultures, constantly offering itself the chance to rise up by obeying and deviate explosively into a new conformity? After all, if you really want to change things, you should line up right here and put this uniform on along with all the other anarchists. And as the octopus who worked at the sushi bar once told me, I'm bringing down the system from within. What is the status of the mainstream if it enforces its status as the mainstream by acting as though its status was dangerously low and in need of rebellious uprising and reinforcement? I guess the whole point of Adler's idea about the inferiority complex is that it lets you work on getting more of something by making you feel like you don't have enough of it. Need to control people more? Start feeling like control is slipping away and tell everyone. This strange reverse enforcement makes it very hard to tell who actually has what status. And who does what to have what status? How does one side of any equation stand out as up or down? Who's the protagonist in a situation where being up is a rebellion against a perceived up? When you sympathize with someone who's being hard on themselves, why sympathize with the victim? What about the sadist inside that same person? What about the part of him or her who's being hard on the other part, the part that's probably enjoying itself, punishing and discharging its power? Are you sympathetic to that? Do you share its enjoyment? Which side are you really on? Well, while you're thinking that one over, I've been Layman Pascal with the Status of Status edition on the Cinematic Asylum on CILU 102.7 FM, and this, for some reason, is the Simon & Simon theme.
When you use a War Amps key tag, you protect your keys. If you lose your keys, the finder can call the War Amps or drop them in any mailbox. And the War Amps will return them to you by courier for free. Order your key tags today at waramps.ca.
I'm Earl Snow. You need to join me for 2 hours of new jazz, Fridays at 9 a.m. on CILU. It's guaranteed to be one fine morning, 9 to 11 a.m.
CILU is sponsored in part by the students of Lakehead University, our listeners, and our sponsors. At this time, we would like to thank the following sponsors for their continuous support.
The Foundry at 242 Red River Road. Open 11 a.m. to 2 a.m. Monday to Saturday, featuring folk